Hi everyone, my name is Steven, and over the past year, I've spent every single day writing a research paper on Asian American religions, which I ended up presenting at an academic conference at UC Berkeley called the APARRI conference. Today's video will be split up into 4 portions, and feel free to skip to whatever portion best appeals to you. The first portion is going to be talking about my journey in writing my research paper. The second portion is going to be talking about what it was like preparing for the APARRI conference and some mistakes and tips. The third portion is going to be talking about what it was like at the APARRI conference. And the fourth portion is going to be talking about key takeaways. However, before I get into my story, I would like to talk about some context to how I got into the research area. So first, my parents are both immigrants. They came from China. But upon coming to the US, they converted to Christianity. And I was always very confused to why they converted despite coming from a secular and Buddhist country. And so I always had this question in my mind for the past 3 or 2 years, but I finally decided to actually pursue it. So I decided to actually read some hard literature rather than just skimming Google. The first 2 books I read were by Fenggang Yang and Kwok Pui-lan. And these 2 books were incredibly difficult to read, partly because they were very in-depth. On one hand, Fenggang Yang dived very in-depth into sociology and ethnic and racial studies. On the other hand, Kwok Pui-lan dived very deep into the field of post-colonial theology. The first book I read, which was Fenggang Yang's book, was very difficult to read, and that was partly because it dived very deep into some certain concepts like race, ethnicity, assimilation, the assimilation melting pot that I actually had no experience with prior. So reading that book initially was very difficult. On the other hand, Kwok Pui-lan's post-colonial theology was just very difficult to consume. And this is probably because theology, to me at least personally, is very difficult to understand if you don't know how to approach those books. And so initially, when I first wanted to write a paper or to get into this field, I was very confused, and that's partly because I dove way too deep into some of these topics. And this mistake will be highlighted later in the second portion of the video, but I want to continue with my journey. So eventually I finished the 2 books after 3 to 4 months, but this was after a lot of thorough reading. And afterwards I decided, okay, I really want to pursue this topic further. But I realized that my question of why my parents converted to Christianity was already answered by Fenggang Yang and many other authors. And so I decided to change my question for the next following months, which was very tiring. But I would like to say it was also very rewarding because I got to read a lot of more literature. So at this point, after finishing the 2 books, I was just reading more and more papers, but I really didn't know what I was doing. And so I decided to email some historians, some sociologists, and just people generally in the field of Asian American religions to better understand what I could do. And so that lasted around 3 to 4 months, where I was just constantly emailing, constantly talking to these professors and these historians, but also just reading a lot. And I was consuming a lot of literature every single day, but I was doing it in a very bad way. But again, this will be mentioned in the second portion of this video. The funny thing about emailing a lot of professors and historians and getting a lot of feedback, but also a lot of perspectives, was I became very confused. And this was because a lot of people were telling me different ideas and different ways I could approach a topic, but I myself didn't even know what topic I wanted to do. And so I ended up just talking, but never actually knowing what I wanted to do. And so again, I spent maybe 1 to 2 months trying to find a question, but also trying to find how I would go about answering that question. In that 1 to 2 month span, I never actually discovered what my question would be, but I did narrow down my subject matter. I did find out that I was more interested in my generation, the second generation experience, but also understanding, why they choose to attend a multi-ethnic church, why they choose to attend a predominantly white church, why they choose to attend an Asian American church. I was very interested by these motivational factors, and I really wanted to understand why certain second generations decided to partake in some churches and not others. And so now I started to gather kind of a big database of the papers I needed to read. I started talking to some professors more thoroughly about kind of the direction I wanted to go. And at this point, I was talking to myself and I was saying, you know what, this is possible. You can publish a paper, or you can find a way to bring this paper, or this whatever work that you create, to the public in a way that is satisfactory. And I tried doing this, but I didn't realize how difficult writing a paper would actually be, but I also didn't know exactly what I was doing. And what I mean by that is I didn't actually know how to write a paper. I just had this goal in mind and I tried shooting for it. Luckily, at the same time that I was thinking through the process of how to write a research paper, my professor recommended me to submit my paper if I had the chance to an APARRI conference, the one that I actually attended a couple weeks ago. And this APARRI conference was a very niche conference, and that is because it is the only academic conference for Asian American religions. So this was a big shot for me to get my work to the public. And so I was shooting for this as a goal, but also shooting for another goal, which was to publish my paper. But at this time, my main goal was just to publish my paper, and so I worked very hard. I decided to talk to more and more teachers, this time in a different way. Instead of asking them their perspective, asking them more of tips and tricks that I can keep in mind when I'm writing a paper or when I'm reading a lot of research or literature, and how to incorporate that into my research paper. So I became very obsessed with trying to get my paper published, or more specifically, just trying to make my work the best it could be. And so over the late winter to late spring duration, I spent every single day 2 to 5 hours constantly writing and constantly reading. Over, spring break, I spent probably 5 to 8 hours just writing straight up. And this was a very difficult process because it required me to write a lot of research that took the past year of reading all into 50, 60 pages. And so I spent a long time really planning, outlining, and then figuring out how to write it. And when I tell you that I was obsessed with this, I was really obsessed. Every single day, no matter in what class I'd be, I would always be thinking about how to write the paper, the best way to phrase, this thing, or the best way to kind of organize my thoughts. And then at night, I would come home, I would sleep around 2 a.m. or 1 a.m., which is kind of bad because I test the next day, but it was kind of important and necessary for me to actually get my work done. And so I was constantly researching, reading and researching. It really absorbed all of my attention. And this was good in the sense that I actually was able to get my paper pretty finished before the APARRI conference deadline, but at the same time, it really destroyed my mental health because of something I will mention a bit later in this journey. Before I get into that one event that kind of caused my breakdown, I will talk a bit more about what I really spent those last couple months doing. So the last couple months, I spent a long time networking and interviewing a lot of people. When I mean a lot, I mean 7, but I sent a lot of emails. It's just very difficult to find anyone who has the time to really talk to me because my interviews generally lasted 45 minutes to 1 hour, and not a lot of people have the time to actually do that interview with no pay for a random high schooler. So I got 7 interviews, most of them were from Ivy League students. And this was actually pretty good because it worked out in my favor later on when I was doing my research, and I realized that I had reduced some confounding factors by essentially making my group more Ivy League or more, from selective colleges, if that makes sense. After a couple months of writing, I finally finished my first draft. It was around 60 pages long without citations, and from then on I needed to revise. I had about 1 month to really dive into my written work and break it down, make it as organized as possible and easy to read. Again, keep in mind that at this time I really wanted to publish my paper, and so I knew my work had to be spectacular as a high schooler and very, very good considering I only had 7 interviews. At this moment, I was optimistic, but in the back of my head, I was like, okay, I know this is probably unrealistic. But for me personally, I really wanted to publish my paper, and so I continued revising every single day. I remember over spring break, I almost actually burnt out because I was reading and I was writing so much. And the worst part was I didn't really have that much access to the research papers, and also because this field is so niche that it's actually difficult to find all the current research that is being talked about your subject. Plus, I'm a high schooler, so I don't have access to a lot of the research papers. So I had to find, different ways to access them, generally through the library, but that also took time. And yes, reading was difficult, but writing and revising was definitely the most mentally difficult process. What I mean by revising or writing was the most difficult process, I mean that when you're revising, you realize that your paper has a lot of holes or logical fallacies, or you realize your work is just not the way you wanted it to be. When you're initially writing for the first draft, you aren't really checking a lot of your logic. You're just writing, you're in the moment. But it's when you come back and when you revise that you're like, okay, this doesn't make sense. And so that happened with me very frequently. And each time I stumbled upon a certain part of my academic paper and I was saying to myself, this doesn't sound right, or this isn't the way I wanted it to sound, I felt my self-esteem lower. At one point, I really debated on whether I could keep writing. I had spent a large majority of my high school junior year actually writing this paper, and it was very sad realizing that it didn't turn out the way I wanted it to be. And I remember this very clearly. Near the end of March, I essentially gave up. I read my paper for about the 10th time. I had thrown out so many drafts of my papers, done so many annotations, and I realized that my paper was just not up to my standards. And so this was actually after I submitted my abstract to the APARRI conference, and I hadn't heard from them yet. So initially I felt, okay, this was all for nothing. I didn't even, get into the APARRI conference, and also my paper is just not good. And so I took a break and I told myself, it's okay. You learned a lot from all the reading, from all the writing. You've become much of a better writer and also of a researcher. So, those are pluses. But deep down, I felt a lot of pain because I worked very hard and I spent a lot of my time. I was obsessed with this subject. And being obsessed really makes the outcome very important because that's what you're really obsessed with. And so I quit at the end of March, but a miracle happened, or I wouldn't say a miracle, I would say my work was just not that bad. So in April, my paper was accepted into the APARRI conference, and I was so excited, I almost cried. This is partly because I worked so hard for it, and also because I really wanted my paper to reach the public audience, to reach, the scholarly discourse. That was the main thing I really wanted. But despite my initial response of happiness, the head of the conference, which is Carolyn Chen, I talked to her. She's super nice, a really nice person to talk to, and also very smart, very academic. She asked me, Steven, can you send your research paper? I was a little confused, but I realized why, because I was a high schooler who submitted a paper to an academic conference where generally high schoolers don't even do. And so I was very nervous when I sent her my paper because, as I mentioned throughout this journey, I felt like my paper was really bad. She looked at it, she gave me the thumbs up. And later on, at the end of the conference, she would tell me that my work was actually very good. This gave me a boost of happiness, but also gave me a boost of pride because I realized my work wasn't actually that bad. I just made it seem way worse than it actually was. And so that was my biggest mistake, was just underestimating myself and truly thinking I couldn't do it. And so afterwards, I got my paper accepted. I realized that this is the best avenue. Now that I reflect, I do realize my paper is basically unpublishable at that time because I had too little interviews and my paper was also not revised enough. And I know a lot of people go through this process of revising and writing as any academic scholar would. But for me, I really wanted to present something or to propose my work to a conference or to the public in some manner or not by the end of the junior year, and this was the perfect way for me to do so. Eventually, I cut down my paper, I fit it into a 15-minute presentation, which was required, and I also received a $2,000 grant to head to the APARRI conference at UC Berkeley because as of now, I'm in Massachusetts, and it costs a lot of money to go to San Francisco, but to also live there. But that's really it for my journey. It was definitely like a roller coaster, but it was definitely very rewarding at the end, and I also learned a lot from the entire process. And I highly recommend, if you have any question like I did about such a simple subject or about any subject, you should definitely try writing a research paper. Alright, let's get to the second portion of this video, which is going to be talking about what I did in preparation for the APARRI conference, but also some tips and mistakes. The way this portion of this video is going to go is I'm going to be talking about some big mistakes I made, and then also some tips that will help you avoid those mistakes I had made. First, one of the biggest mistakes I made was not planning enough. I cannot stress this more than enough, especially when you begin your research and when you get to the middle and to the end. Like throughout your entire research journey, this is so important. What I mean by planning is when I started research and reading, I didn't even know how much to read. I didn't know what to read. I just read. And yes, that's good if you just want to get interested in the topic, but it was really bad because I had a deadline. I really wanted to get this paper out early, and so I spent a large majority of my time just reading mindlessly. And so setting deadlines for, how to read or when to read or what to read is very good. Another problem with my planning was I was sort of unreasonable. Yes, I am someone who can definitely work 5 to 8 hours each night on extracurriculars and only feel burnt out after 3 months. But some of my planning was actually very, very bad. And it wasn't because I couldn't reach it through hard work or determination or grit. It was simply because I didn't have access. If you set a deadline for how many papers you want to read or when you want to organize them, you have to realize what you have in store. If I set myself a deadline that I wanted to finish 15 papers by the end of 2 weeks, but I don't even have access to some of them, or some of the papers aren't even related, then obviously I've spent my time not really doing anything, and I have wasted a deadline and a goal, and now I have to change my plans midway through reading. And lastly, I feel like deadlines in the middle of your research journey is just as important as the end. What I mean is, in the middle of your research journey, you're probably going to be collecting data, or you're going to be doing like the bulk of your research. It's very important at that time to have very structured and thorough, research goals or plans that you can follow. Now I'm going to be talking about a tip to avoid this mistake. This tip will be split up into 2 portions. First, large deadlines, and second, smart deadlines. First, large deadlines. Not only do you have to, plan when you want to finish reading a paper or finish writing or drafting, you should definitely plan the very long deadlines. When do you really want to get this paper out? That is the most important question. And you can use that deadline to basically split up the rest of your deadlines. So this is a very simple tip that everybody can follow. The second tip is a little more subjective to each person, but it is smart deadlines. Like I said before, if you set a deadline for reading a ton of research papers, but you don't even have access to some of them, or some of them aren't even in your scope or in your research area, then it's kind of useless reading them. You should always look at everything you have and plan out accordingly to that. Also, think about your schedule. High schoolers, college students, everybody is very busy. So obviously do not burn out, because if you burn out, you're never going to reach your other deadlines, and you're also just not going to write a very good research paper. But ultimately, you're just not going to like the subject you're writing about because you spent the entire time just forcing yourself to read or to write. So smart deadlines. All right, so second mistake I made was reading and taking notes way too in depth. This is so easily overlooked, and I feel like it's a huge trap or a huge hole that many beginner researchers start off with, is that they read an entire book from cover to cover, and they take probably 15 pages of notes, maybe 30, depending on how thoroughly they're reading it. But I want to stress that this is not the correct way to research, at least in the beginning. And so when I was researching, I made this huge mistake as well. And so the first 2 books that I read, which was Feng Gangyang's book and Kwok Pui Lan's post-colonial theology book, I spent 3 to 4 months reading them, and I didn't even know what I wanted out of them. I was just reading and reading page by page every single word, and I was taking notes on every single paragraph. This was a terrible idea. It wasted a lot of my time and made me super confused, and I just didn't get anything out of it. I only remember the big ideas and some of the small parts, but eventually none of those books actually came to help me out later on. Fenggang maybe a bit, but Kwok Bilan, I didn't use her book at all. And so what I recommend for a tip that will avoid this mistake is something I made up. It's like a phrase called VH skimming. This is kind of a combination of different research skills I learned from a lot of people, but also kind of like basic fundamental research skills. So VH skimming is a way to not read too in depth, but to also develop a really strong database full of research papers or books. So V skimming, or the first part of VH skimming, is called vertical skimming, or stands for vertical skimming. So for vertical skimming, I recommend that whenever you stumble upon a research paper or a book, you read the introduction or the abstract, and then you read the conclusion and discussion. And from then, you take notes on the main idea and very roughly what kind of argument the paper is making. This is so important because it avoids getting too nitty-gritty with all of the research methodology and understanding all these big concepts, and it just gives you straight up what you need to know when you want to organize your research. The H skimming, or the H part of the VH skimming, is called horizontal skimming. The way I like to think about this is gathering a lot of your research. After you have done V skimming for a couple papers or couple articles, you want to find a way to group them and organize them. And so H skimming essentially allows you to go through all those main ideas or those small notes that you took and group them based on, big ideas that you think connect some of them or don't connect some of them. But additionally, H skimming can also stand for finding new papers, because in the citations, a lot of these papers you're reading, there's like a gold mine of a lot of other papers in the field that you probably don't know about. And especially if you're coming to this field as a novice or you don't know anything about it, it's super important to know what everybody's talking about or what were the fundamental papers back in like the 1900s. And so H skimming is going through the citations of all the books that you read or the papers that you read, and then also looking through all of the main ideas and notes that you took and essentially grouping a bunch of papers together that can serve as organization. Eventually, after VH skimming, you will have a lot of papers with a lot of mini ideas. But once you have this, you can start grouping out big ideas and thinking, okay, this is interesting, or these group of articles which talk about some form of like racism appeals to me a lot, and so I want to investigate it. And so you can go back to those papers, and instead of skimming, now you can read in depth. This is so good because I feel like it gives you a bird's eye view and also allows you to organize your thoughts before you start your in-depth research. Now, this section would not be complete if I did not talk about how to take notes. So when you take notes, there are generally two types of notes I think everybody should take. One, kind of big picture ideas. What is the main idea? What is the main argument? What is their methodology? What are they trying to accomplish? What is the purpose of this paper? Are they arguing against anyone? And then the second portion, or the second kind of notes that you should take, is how you feel. This is so key, and I think a lot of people overlook it because it's kind of strange. Why would you ask yourself a personal question when you're taking notes, objective notes? And personal questions essentially give you a direction to where you want to take the research in. For example, did you find this interesting? Why do you think the author made this argument? Does it appeal to you? Do you think the author made a fallacy? A lot of these questions make you think about what interests you and also gives you a new direction to take your research in. So both of these notes are very, very important. So the third mistake I made was really bad. It was just no outline. So a lot of English classes tell us that outlines are very important, but they don't tell us exactly how in-depth our outlines have to be. So when I started my research, especially the writing section, I had a rough outline with a couple of the main ideas with subsections and main ideas, but I'm telling you, this is not a really good idea. Yes, an outline is good, and I took a big step forward in making that outline, but it was not good enough and just not in depth enough for a full out research paper. And so what happened was, when I had this really rough outline, whenever I started writing, I just basically could not organize my thoughts. Even when I did, I looked back when I was revising and it made no sense. All the order was jumbled up and none of the things I was writing really made sense when it came together in the bigger picture. And so my tip for this is very thorough outlines. Instead of just making a rough outline with like the topic and then kind of like main subsections and then maybe some more subsections, you should really pull out all the quotes that you're using, all of the papers you're using, organize them based into the outline, kind of like fitting them into small sections. And then you should also focus on making sure the outline includes your arguments and how they tie back. Your outline should be extremely thorough at the end, right before you write. It should be so thorough that if you gave it to someone else, they would understand what you're arguing, why you're arguing, and a lot more. I'm just saying that outlines are extremely important before you start writing because it can make the writing process much easier and much faster. So the fourth mistake I made is not really a mistake about researching, but a mistake emotionally. I feel like throughout my journey, I always underestimated myself and I was always very pessimistic about my writing, especially about being a researcher. And this mistake really caused me to really start to actually hate the subject and hate my writing. And this was a very unhealthy relationship, especially in the revising portion of my research. And truly, I think that my research was actually not that bad. I read my paper again, and it was truly pretty well written. It was well thought out. I actually was able to pull out something interesting and unique to show to the people at the APARRI conference. And truly, what really made me kind of underestimate myself and become pessimistic was that I just didn't believe in myself. And that was a huge problem. It affected my mood and it really made me doubt my kind of enjoyment of writing research papers or doing research. But now that I reflect, I realize that underestimating myself was probably the biggest problem I had. Now let's get into the third portion of this video, which is talking about my experience at the APARRI conference at UC Berkeley. The APARRI conference happens around June to July, and I had a grant to go there. So I flew by plane, I got there, and then I went to UC Berkeley for the first day, and UC Berkeley has such a nice campus, really great people, and the first day we met this guy called Jin Yong. And he is such an amazing graphic novel artist, and he wrote one of my favorite graphic novels that I read as a child, which is American Born Chinese. You guys should definitely check that out. I was actually so surprised and so happy when I first met him that I couldn't really contain the excitement, and I did get his autographs, so that was really nice. The APARRI conference started with this really good keynote speaker, which was Gene, and it really, kicked off the APARRI conference to a good start. So the second day rolled around quickly, and before I knew it, I was back at the conference again with a bunch of academic scholars and people who I cited. This was such a great event because I got to meet so many new people with so many unique perspectives, and some of the people that I talked to were people who I talked about in my research papers, which was very fascinating and very, very fun. So on the second day, the first portion of the APARRI conference was dedicated to discussing the theme of the APARRI conference, while the latter portion was dedicated to more workshops and paper presentations. In the afternoon, I had to present my paper. I was not actually that nervous to present my paper because the first couple of days warmed me up and I realized everybody was very kind and nice, and so I wasn't nervous at all. But before coming to this conference, I was definitely nervous. And I was definitely unsure because I didn't know if anyone would take me seriously as a high schooler, but I was also unsure if my work was even to the level of other people's work. But back to the subject of presenting my paper, I eventually presented my paper. It took 15 minutes. We had a Q&A session. We had some boba afterwards. It was a really nice event. I feel like everybody was very encouraging, but I also believe everybody was very interested in my work. And I think that was the best part, was that everybody who came to the conference really wanted to be here. And when we talked about religion, Asian American religion, or just about Asian Americans in general, everybody seemed very intrigued by the subject. And this is one of the times that you can actually be nerdy with the people around you, which is hard to find in other schools because, from my high school, no one's going to be nerdy about Asian American religions like I am because it's such a niche subject. But upon coming to this conference, there were a lot of people who were willing to get all nitty-gritty with me. And I also think another key aspect of this conference was that everybody brought a unique perspective and also a unique presentation. I feel like when I was doing my research, I really was limited to only ethnic and racial studies or only to some parts of religion. And so I didn't really open my mind to like Buddhism or Hinduism or meditation or Taiwan. And so this was very interesting to hear about everybody else's projects. There was one about transnationalism, which was so intriguing. I really enjoyed that presentation. But I feel like that is kind of the highlight of the APARRI or academic conference, which is that you get to meet a lot of new people and network a lot, yes, but also talk to them and hear very unique perspectives, interesting stories, and everybody has these like really big goals and really nice goals about, what they want to pursue a bit later or what research is next on their minds. And that was also very interesting. Finally, let's get to the fourth portion of this video, which is some highlights about everything, about my journey and about presenting my paper. So, like I said before, this journey was very difficult at the end. But throughout, I felt like I grew so much as a researcher and a writer and a presenter.